My name is Julian Richards. I'm the managing editor of Open Democracy. For those who don't know much about us, we are a media platform which aims to challenge power and inspire change throughout the world. We want this conversation to involve you as much as possible. So particular thank you, first of all, to everybody who submitted questions and comments ahead of time. We're going to address as many of those as we can. If you're joining us on Zoom, you can, if you've got a question or comment for us, you can click on the chat icon at the bottom of your screen and type it to the chat window. If you're joining from Facebook, you can add your input there and it'll be fed back. This is all quite low tech, so please excuse any technical hitches or interruptions from pets or stray children. Should just mention this event is part of our partnership with Ryerson University, we call Pandemic Borders. And you can read all of the articles in that series on the page that I'm just going to put into the chat right now. With that, I'm going to hand over to our chair, Anna Triandafyllidou, who is the Canada Excellence Research Chair in Migration and Integration at Ryerson University. Anna, over to you.
Thank you very much, Julian, and thank you all. And Julian, a special thanks for saying my last name so fluently. It's great to see you all in yet another webinar with the very, how can I say, challenging or provocative questions. Our attitudes towards immigration changing right now with the pandemic or also in the near future. And I'm very pleased to welcome a very distinguished panel today. Andrew Parkin, who is Executive Director of the Environics Institute, and I think known, at least those of us who live in Canada, about their research on public attitudes. Daniel Hiebert from the UBC, a very well-known geographer on immigration. My colleague, Usha George from Ryerson, also a very distinguished scholar working on migration and integration. And I have, unfortunately, to excuse Keith Banting, who had the sudden health problem, may I say not COVID, but he wasn't, suddenly this morning, he was not able to join us. But I hope we can keep your interest and we would very much welcome your questions in this 1-hour webinar. So I'll start immediately with giving the floor to Andrew to give us some highlights about the recent results on public attitudes towards immigration.
All right, thank you, Anna. Thank you, Julian, and hello to everyone, and thanks for being part of the discussion. So let me take a few minutes to describe our most recent findings and then maybe comment on what might be going on. So I think the question I'm supposed to answer is the pandemic changing attitudes towards immigration? And the answer is probably yes and no. I mean, are attitudes in Canada changing? Yes, they're becoming more favorable over time. Is the pandemic the cause of that change? Probably not. So essentially what we're seeing is a continuation of what was already in place. So we updated the survey. So Environics has data in some cases that goes back to the late 1970s, not in every case, but we updated the Focus Canada survey that has been done over that period. We did it with our partners at the University of Ottawa's Impact Initiative and Century Initiative, and we're very pleased to be working with them. And so I'll describe the findings very briefly because we're not going to do a big PowerPoint. We have about 6 or 7 different measures of statements about immigration. And on each one in the latest survey, which was done in September, the responses were more favorable towards immigration and refugees than they ever had been. So regardless of whether we were talking about, just is there too much immigration? Canadians disagree with that by a ratio of about 2 to 1. Are immigrants good for the economy or do they take jobs? So Canadians strongly feel that they have a very strongly positive impact on the economy and reject the proposition that immigrants are a threat to employment in the country. More mixed views on whether immigrants are taking too long to take on Canadian values, whatever that might mean. But that mixed picture is still, again, more, there's less concern about that issue now than there had been before. So previously, Canadians had been very strongly concerned about the extent to which immigrants take on Canadian values, and now they are much less concerned. Regardless of whether you're actually, asking about numbers or the cultural dimension or the economic dimension, the trend is all in the same direction. Just to emphasize that, I want to be clear about, the claim that we're making. We are not saying that Canadians are uniformly positive about immigrants and immigration, or that all Canadians have the same views. There are a range of views, and on some of these questions, the population is quite divided. Again, what we are saying is that the trend is consistent across all items. It is consistently positive or becoming more positive over time. So I think it is accurate to say that what our survey shows is Canadians have never been as sort of open or welcoming or supportive of immigration than they are today. So Anna then asked me the difficult question of why. So I'll try and just say a few words about that. And I think it really depends. I didn't have a chance to ask you this back, but it really depends on exactly what we're trying to answer. It's a question, why wasn't there a change of some kind or a reversal during the pandemic? That's one kind of why question. There's a more general question of why do Canadians think this way? And that's maybe the topic of another webinar. But let me address the first question. I mean, we did go into this with the hypothesis that if anything was going to upend the trend that we had already been seeing, it might be the pandemic. It's a crisis. People are under stress. It's a health crisis, but it's also an economic crisis. So people's concerns about employment might be accentuated. So it was our working hypothesis that the trend might be at this time reversed, and that is not the case. So it's not easy to explain why. I'll say two things about it. Firstly, the responses on this question are not isolated or different from responses on a broader range of questions. So at the same time as Canadians are becoming more open to immigration, they're becoming more concerned about racism or more aware of racism, more aware of the need to combat racism. They are also more concerned with what they've been seeing going on in the United States. So attitudes about the United States in general were becoming much less favorable. For the first time ever, Canadians were more likely to say we're becoming less like the US than more like the US. For those of you who kind of followed the last decades of debates about economic integration in North America and so on, know that there's always been this concern that the Canadian culture would be kind of pulled all along with the lines of commerce and so on, and that we're less concerned about that than ever. There's also things that may seem unrelated, but there's growing support for the idea of a basic income. There's strong support for government intervention around daycare, elder care, and so on. So in other words, if you just stand back from it in general, Canadians are more positive about a lot of things, all of which can be kind of grouped under either the sort of heading of diversity on the one hand and generosity on the other hand. So the attitudes of immigration are consistent with a sort of overall broader set of attitudes and not kind of in isolation. And then maybe I should probably wrap up. The last thing I will say is I do think that the Trump effect in Canada, or the effect of the Trump presidency in Canada, maybe ended up being the opposite of what some people feared in 2016. In 2016, there was a little bit of a concern that kind of Trump would drag everyone down with him and bleed over the border in a way. And I think what we see in this data is the opposite, that the stronger the sort of personality around Trump became in the United States, and the way that spilled over to issues around Black Lives Matter and so on, a number of different issues, the more Canadians moved away from it. So while the trends that we're seeing on immigration are consistent with what we've seen for a while, if we want to explain like why in the pandemic did they sort of get an extra oomph, and this is conjecture on my part, but I think there was a certain reaction to the events of the summer and the fall in the United States where Canadians were sort of wanted to reaffirm their own approach to these issues and differentiate themselves from what they were seeing in the US. And I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Andrea. I think you're pointing to something very interesting, that we have often thought the public attitudes on immigration are mainly guided by instrumental thinking. So, and we do have, of course, data that showed when there is an economic decline, maybe, you know, concerns rise, and with them concerns about newcomers and about, you know, competing for scarce resources. But I think what you're mentioning is very interesting, which is about how self-definitions and national identity, feelings of national belonging, and the whole repertoire of this is very closely intertwined with public attitudes towards migration and diversity more broadly. But I'll give the floor to Daniel now, who's going to give us some answers to the questions. What have been the implications of the pandemic for Canadian immigration? So we talked about the level of attitudes, but what is the reality on the ground?
Thanks very much, Anna. And I'm going to be talking, as you say, about something quite different from what we just heard. But I think there is a way I can connect the points that Andrew has very capably made to what I'm going to be speaking about, and that is all the things that Andrew said give us a sense that the public gives the Canadian government a lot of latitude in terms of policy, since we have a generally favorable view about immigration. So that's kind of an important backdrop to what I'm going to be speaking about. Now, first thing I want to say is Canada has a history of connecting its immigration policy with economic crises. In the past, for about 50 years after World War II, whenever there was a downturn in the economy, Canada reduced its immigration flows very dramatically. But that policy changed in the 1990s. And for the last 30 years, there have been two other elements that have motivated Canadian policy during economic recessions. One was the idea that the demography of Canada demands more people coming, especially young people coming. So that's kind of been maintained. That's been an idea to maintain immigration. The other is that if immigration is set towards privileging economic immigration, that will have a propulsive effect on economic recovery. And so those attitudes became embedded in the policy system in the 1990s, and they're still with us. So when we think about what Canada has done with respect to the COVID emergency, it has attempted to keep immigration going because those ideas are firmly embedded in the policy system. However, it couldn't quite work. And it couldn't quite work because COVID is not just a health crisis and an economic crisis, but it is also an immobility crisis. Around the world, I think the last I heard, 168 governments around the world have closed their borders. Some a little bit and some complete. And so that has made movement very difficult. Furthermore, on March, I think it was the 18th, IRCC told its staff to go work from home. And suddenly you have a bureaucracy of thousands of people trying to recreate the work they do from their kitchen tables, dining room tables, coffee tables, etc. There was a big hit to productivity. So although the attitude was there to continue immigration as normal, the capacity to do that was severely hampered. And so what's going to happen in 2020 is we're going to see about a half of the total amount of immigration that was projected for this year actually happen. But actually you can then turn that number around and say, well, wait a minute now, how did we have still 180,000 immigrants entering Canada during a time when we have closed borders? So how do we explain the resilience, not the full resilience, but the partial resilience of immigration at this particular point in time? And the answer to that has been twofold. On the one hand, when Canada announced its closed borders on March the 18th, there was also an exception made for people who already had the right to land. So people who had a piece of paper that came in, or an email that came that said you have the right to be an immigrant to Canada, they were allowed to still come to the border and claim that right. But anybody that would receive that invitation after March the 18th was no longer eligible to come to Canada. So anyway, we have like a bulk of people that were still coming through. And then the other thing Canada did was to turn very aggressively to what you could call inland immigration, to convert temporary visas into permanent visas. So that enables immigration without actually crossing a border. People can be in Canada already, say as a worker, as a student, as a visitor, and if they filled out the right application forms, they can be admitted to Canada officially and become an immigrant, even though they didn't cross a border. So that's really what has been happening. Now the question becomes, okay, so we're hoping that the pandemic is going to be over soon, now that especially we have these vaccine announcements. How is the policy system going to get back on track and get to the point where we begin to see larger numbers again and get past this drop by half that we're seeing in 2020? And the question, again, given the demographic realities of Canada and given the economic interpretation of immigration, and also given public favorable attitudes, the question isn't if Canada will get back to larger numbers of immigration, but when. And we heard an answer to that question very recently when Minister Mendicino, our Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, announced that we are going to not only resume the course in 2021, but in fact add to the number of immigrants coming in 2021. So the earlier expectation is Canada would have received about 350,000 immigrants in 2021. Now the target is for 401,000, and then incremental rises since then. So now the question is, how is that going to happen? What I think we can certainly predict is that borders will not just suddenly reopen on January the 1st of 2021 to enable this 400,000 people to arrive. We are still going to be dealing with a great deal of immobility, I think, for perhaps another half of the year. So in the short term, how is Canada going to operationalize this policy? And I think it will be done in two ways. One, probably by introducing some kind of new exception to enable immigrants to land in Canada and then go through quarantine and various kinds of procedures to verify their health status. But I think that's probably going to happen early in 2021, and also an even more aggressive attempt to advance the idea of inland immigration. And I know that I won't say anything more about this because I know Usha is going to talk about this, so I'll give a segue to her, but I'll just say a few more points and then give the floor over to her. I think that we can just very quickly identify a few concerns about this policy and these practices, and then I'll let go of my time. And I think we should consider this as a short-term set of concerns and a long-term set of concerns. In the long term, I think everything will be fine. We have a rigorous kind of policy around immigration in Canada. We have all the various background factors that make it work. But in the short term, basically in 2021, the intention is to add 400,000 people, which translates to about 250,000 working age adults, into a labor market that's got 1.5 million unemployed. That's going to be a big challenge. That is not going to be something that's easy over the next year. In the short run, what we know is that immigrants who arrive at a time of pronounced economic recession do experience economic scarring effects. And what that really leads us to is there needs to be an enhancement of Canadian social policy around these sorts of issues. And also, Canadian society is really going to depend on those institutions that support immigrant integration even more in the coming year or two than we've seen in the past. And I'll leave it at that for now, Anna.
Thank you, Dan. I think what you were suggesting is that we're going to have a Keynesian policy where I think the government will fund the whole settlement sector to assist these people. But of course, we can also talk a little bit later about what will be the scarring effects and whether we would expect a change in the attitudes, because that's also something that some people are concerned about. But I would like to invite Usha now to give us, to tell us what could be other policy proposals, like beyond what we have heard from Minister Mendicino, in addressing, the situation. Usha, your microphone.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. I just want to follow up on what Daniel just stopped saying, is basically the number of economic immigrants who are coming to Canada is going to reduce. Actually, in one of the studies done by Royal Bank of Canada in May 2020, they are estimating almost like 45% decline in permanent residents in 2020. So that's a huge number. And IRCC also has similar figures saying that, well, the number of permanent residents who are coming under as economic immigrants have declined at 26%, and they are estimating a lot more can happen. And we, again, I'm not going to repeat what Daniel has said. So my initial argument around this is, how do you solve this problem, is to say that we have three categories of people who are already in Canada. Maybe we should consider giving permanent residence to these individuals who are actually performing very useful roles in Canada. And the pandemic has highlighted the importance of these workers for the economy and society. Some of the three categories are the temporary foreign workers, the undocumented workers in Canada, and of course the people on student visas. One of the estimates in 2017 said there are approximately about 550,000 temporary workers in Canada. And then these workers actually perform essential services such as agriculture, food production, food supply infrastructure, health services, social care, and these activities were highlighted during this pandemic. About 60% of these temporary foreign workers actually work in primary agriculture, food production, fish processing, all of those kinds of activities, which are basically considered to be low skilled, but they have become essential workers. Their plight has also become quite highlighted during the time of the pandemic. A number of people have died of COVID, and the health and social amenities that are available to them are less than ideal. And even the kinds of services that they are eligible for are not even given to them. And therefore, these workers who are seen as temporary for one classification have become essential, and these temporary workers are actually fulfilling permanent jobs. Actually, they're completing permanent jobs in Canada. So that there is an irony right there, and we need to look into that one. I'll give you an update on that one as soon as I finish this part of my presentation. The second category of individuals that we can consider for permanent residence is the undocumented workers in Canada. Again, we don't have real numbers, but estimates are that there are more than 500,000 undocumented workers in Canada. The majority of them live in Toronto, Montreal, or Vancouver. These workers support critical sectors like the construction industry, where there is a shortage of labor. And who are these undocumented workers? They are mainly workers who come to Canada and ignore the limits of their visa, or those who have illegally entered the country. Even though we call them illegal, actually, according to the immigration policy in Canada, crossing the border at non-points of entry is not considered to be a crime. So anyway, they are seen as illegal. And sometimes some of them are being smuggled, and some of them actually, when they run their work permit with their particular employer, they change jobs without getting permission. Anyway, there's a whole category of individuals who are non-status individuals. They work in, as I said, construction, hospitality, manufacturing industries, or domestic work. Legally, they are prevented from obtaining a work permit or social insurance number, but they work in the underground economy for low wages and poor and unsafe working conditions. They do not have access to publicly funded healthcare, and non-status individuals experience serious workplace injuries and compromise their health and safety. So even though they pay, they have no access to social services, as I mentioned before. Again, the undocumented workers contribute to the Canadian economy. However, their contributions are never recognized and quantified due to the very nature of their existence in Canada. They're paid under the table, and as a result, the government is unable to tax their earnings. In essence, these two categories of individuals, due to bureaucratic disentitlement of their status, or the immigration processing system, are defined as temporary and undocumented. But the work they do is neither temporary nor superfluous. These are jobs that we need to perform for the economy. Now, my original argument was that why not consider these individuals for permanent status, especially in the economic category. Actually, a recent study that came out of, that was conducted by Statistics Canada in collaboration with the Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada has thrown some light into the increasing importance of temporary foreign workers in the selection and labor market outcomes for new immigrants in Canada. In other words, they have started, I believe they had started the process in early 2000, but more and more they have started selecting the economic class immigrants from the temporary foreign workers. For example, in 2018, about 48% of the economic immigrants came from the temporary foreign workers. In fact, that was news to me. I did not know that they had done that. I believe there's a good series of studies that are going to come out. So right now, as Daniel said before, most of these IRCC folks are working from home, and what is being done or stated is that most of the applications of the temporary foreign workers are being considered for economic immigration, and therefore, as I said, a large number of economic immigrants who are principal applicants are from the temporary working category. The advantage that we have for them is mainly because, or with them is mainly because they already are in Canada and they have what is called the Canadian experience, which is a big barrier for new immigrants to get into the labor market. So they have been tested, they have experienced the system, they are used to Canada, and therefore they are seen as, again, the same study and shows that their economic outcomes are much better than totally new immigrants who are coming from abroad. But we have no indication that the undocumented immigrants are being considered, even though Prime Minister Justin Trudeau stated that undocumented immigrants who worked in the health sector might be considered for permanent residence. We haven't heard any update on that issue. In any case, the number of people who are being selected for permanent residence in the economic category from the temporary workers is not that high in any case, and therefore there's a huge bank of labor power that's sitting there. Now, the attitude towards these individuals, I wouldn't say we are not labeling them as undocumented or temporary, but whoever is called essential workers, whoever is called frontline workers, the public has had such I shouldn't say sympathy, but most welcoming attitude towards that group of people who performed miracles during this pandemic season. So if you're talking about attitude towards immigration, I would like to argue that, well, these categories of people who have been on the margins of Canadian society should be actually brought in as economic immigrants, and then that can actually fulfill our requirement for more economic immigrants. And the case of the undocumented immigrants who work in construction is another important one, because they really have almost all the skills that are required for the Canadian skilled worker program. And in fact, if you look at the category, the criteria that is for the foreign worker program, almost all the criteria are met by these individuals who are already working in Canada. So my final point is that we do have a large number of individuals who can be considered for economic immigration. And due to the lack of, transparency or public knowledge about what's happening behind the scenes, we still feel that these individuals are not given the fair consideration that it requires. And this is one place where Canada can actually consider its values of human dignity, human rights, and diversity, and all of that into practice by actually picking the individuals or choosing the individuals who rightly fulfill the very essential roles that are required for the economy. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much, Usha. That's quite a radical policy proposal. Yeah, and I'm very much tempted to play devil's advocate. I think on one hand, it makes total sense that look no further. We don't need to bring in new people. We can just, and I'm always, I have to say, amused by this expression of landing. I didn't know what the landing does not necessarily mean to land, but actually to change status. So on one hand, that makes total sense. On the other hand, a lot of people would argue that there will be a call effect. So the famous queue jumping effect. And of course, there would be a lot to be said, but before, and we have seen also through, and again, another recent report of of WES, World Education Services, that showed that interest towards immigrating to Canada. So they're surveying the people who submit their, educational credentials for assessment. And they surveyed these people in April, in June, and in August. And compared to April and June, interest to migrate to Canada has increased. So 38% of people surveyed in June said they were more interested. Now this percentage in August was 48% of their surveyed people. And in terms of delay, in June, 32% of the people surveyed said they were planning to delay arrival to Canada. And that percentage in August went up to 12%. Now, of course, one might say that everything looked much more optimistic in August in terms of how the pandemic is going compared to if one surveyed, and probably they are surveying again for October or November. But it is clear also that I think, again, another 50% of people surveyed thought that the economic impact of the pandemic on their country would be higher compared to the impact that will be in Canada. So I think that there are arguments both in favor and against the different policy solutions. But I would like to come back to Andrew and ask him, how does he think the public would see the different policy proposals? So what would be the impact on attitudes? Because we have had these very positive results on the attitudes through your survey repeated in September, but always with the feeling that migration and asylum are very tightly regulated in Canada. So while I think what Usha is proposing is great, but might have this feeling, oh, we're leaving the gates open.
Yeah, I think at a certain point framing matters, by the way in which different policies are presented and justified. So let me give an example. If we go back to, can't remember if it's 2019 or 2018, but when there were more quote unquote irregular crossings at the border, there was a survey at the time that asked Canadians, how do you feel about people walking across the border from the US? And the Canadians felt largely uncomfortable about it. And so that was taken as evidence to say, aha, Canadians are not as welcoming as we think they are, right? They're sort of hypocritical, or they're two-faced, or there's contradictory evidence. But I don't think it's contradictory at all. Because to the extent that Canadians were, you have to be clear about what they were uncomfortable about. Were they uncomfortable about people of a different race or culture being in Canada? No. Were they uncomfortable about Canada growing its population through either immigrants or refugees? No. They were uncomfortable about an issue of process and fairness. And fairness is a value that Canadians are balancing along with other values, including the values related to immigration. So all of which is to say, you know, policies that can be presented as, you know, in part as Usha was explaining, that here's a group of people that have contributed enormously and sacrificed enormously in Canada's effort to combat the pandemic, and there is a fairness owed to them, right, in exchange. That's one framing. And the other framing is your grandparents are in India and they've been waiting for years for their chance to come to Canada, and someone who just didn't submit through the same process is getting it ahead of them. So it really, you know, I hope I'm being clear here, but there is no reason to think that Canadians couldn't be accepting of a number of different policy proposals, but there also are possibilities that they wouldn't. But again, the grounds on which they wouldn't, right, are important. In the UK, when there was, you know, people coming from Calais across the Channel and so on, there were literally political leaders in the UK saying, we have no room, right? No one in Canada is going to say that, right? That's not going to, so there's no guarantee that the public will react positively to everything, because it will be dependent on how it's presented, justified, and managed. But I think in that sense, Dan is correct that there is also a lot of latitude, right? Government policymakers have a lot of latitude. And anyone opposing those policies, I think, also has to be very careful. So if someone made a proposal to, you know, accelerate the rate at which number of people can obtain land status or citizen status, including people who are undocumented, someone could oppose that. But again, they'd have to be very careful on what grounds they were opposing it on. We have seen a political party in Canada that has tried to campaign on essentially on the sense that you know, we can't afford to take in more immigrants and they're driving up housing prices and so on, and that party got 2 to 3% of the vote, right? And but that doesn't mean that another party can not turn this into an issue of management and fairness, and that may play out differently.
Well, thank you, Andrew. I mean, I think it's very interesting what you say. So it's all about fairness. It's about values, and it's about fairness. Fairness of the process, or fairness towards the people who have been waiting in the line. So I want to ask Daniel and Usha, so what would be then the right policy to choose? If it is all about fairness, but fairness can be interpreted in different ways. Daniel.
Yeah, so I'm just trying to make sure I've got the question right. You mentioned fairness towards the migrants and fairness towards Canadians who have already submitted applications for family reunification.
Yeah, I think that's what Andrew was saying. So he was saying that when people opposed the people walking through the border, it was about because they were not respecting the process. It was not because Canadians do not want more immigrants or more asylum seekers, but they want people to go by the rules. And this is a question of value, and specifically of fairness as a value. But then when we privilege those who are in through different means, then this also raises a question of fairness towards those who have, as you know, been waiting as family migrants, or if you want, also as economic migrants.
Yeah, and there's another side to all of this, of course. Yeah, you just mentioned it at the very end of your comment there, which is the question of interest, right? So, so the Canadian government and Canadian media, Canadian intellectuals, I suppose, have all kind of provided a pretty common message, which is that immigration is valuable to Canada, both for demographic reasons and for economic reasons. You could see that reflected in public opinion in Canada. Andrew may have more to say on this matter, but what I've seen in the opinion surveys of Canadians on these issues is they see immigration first and foremost as an economic thing. They see immigration as very good for the economy of Canada. So that's been the kind of interest side of the Canadian equation. There's been, you know, almost unique among countries, a high level of public support for immigration because people feel that it's good for them economically. And you don't see that attitude replicated in very many other countries. Now there's this moment, and I want to come back to what Usha has been saying, where we might be able to see a convergence between the interests on immigration and human rights values around, well, humanitarian values around migration. Those have been a little bit conflicting in the past, right? So we can either have immigration for economic reasons, or against that, we would have more refugees or more people in need coming to Canada. Now, if Canada wants to fulfill those targets that it set, we may be able to see a coming together of those interests and those values. And I think Usha's points, I think, are really valid, that this is a moment when Canada can reach into the population of people who are already here and sort out some of these humanitarian issues, such as undocumented workers and so forth. So there's kind of a really interesting moment that we're in right now. But the other sort of concern I have is, if we start seeing widespread unemployment amongst newcomers, that may feed back into public attitudes and may erode some of those rather favorable background factors that enable the policy latitude I've been talking about. Sorry, that sounds a bit circular, but it's a really complicated situation.
No, I think that is a good point, Daniel. But I would like to ask Usha. So, yeah. I mean, when we talk about public attitudes, they're not just one black box. I mean, and actually, that was a little bit also what Andrew was presenting in the beginning. So maybe your proposals, your radical proposals, would resonate with those who employ construction workers or those who employ senior care home workers, but those who are in these jobs might feel negatively affected. So I think beyond fairness, there may be such situation. What do you think?
Yeah, just a couple of comments. One, when we talk about queue jumping, I read somewhere, and I haven't spoken to an IRCC official yet, that these applications are processed differently. So the fact that 55,000 people want to come to Canada from India does not affect the processing of inland applications. They are kind of done separately, is what I was informed. The other thing is that when you say that the family reunion, people who want to have their families reunited would feel uneasy about these individuals who are being given landed status. There are two categories of individuals. The undocumented or the temporary foreign workers are people who have already been working in the economy. They are engaged in the labor market. They have produced value. They have produced economic outcomes. And they also have what's called the Canadian experience, which is a major issue with newcomers. So in fact, they are not necessarily in competition with total newcomers who are coming from abroad in the economic category, because they are already working in the economy at different levels. And then the other thing is that we are also not saying that we should abandon all our criteria around economic immigration and just give a sort of blanket entry to everyone. No, we can actually be selective, and we can select people on the basis of their contributions, their employment, and what they actually contribute. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Usha. That, of course, yeah, that is, we should not disregard those contributions. But I think I have a couple of questions for Andrew in relation also to whether the positive, I mean, it was John Carla asking earlier in relation to the positive attitudes of Canadians, and whether the Conservative Party's, how can I say, opposition to the Liberals and their discourse about the Safe Third Country Agreement and what happens with the US is probably, or the worrying about this issue is unnecessary because the attitudes are positive. And I also have a question from Naomi about whether terminology matters, the use of the word illegal versus irregular. And I have to say that in Europe, there's been a strong campaigning for many years, to the point that now, to a large extent, the word illegal is not used to characterize a person. So there can be an illegal crossing, but the person is irregular or undocumented. And also, actually, Naomi was suggesting that we could look into the past regularization programs. And I don't know if Dan or Usha would like them to comment about this. that were done in the past. And I was wondering also how big they were, because a regularization program that can be very specific for a few hundreds of people is different than a program that might touch upon thousands of workers and their families. And what was the reaction to that? But perhaps first, Andrew, about the politics of it.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll try not to repeat myself that much, but on the I'll take the terminology question first, and I think that's key in a sense, that these debates matter and the words matter, and I'll use a parallel. I mean, there's an interesting parallel right now in terms of drugs and overdoses and so on, right? So we've come from a background of in the wider Western context, the war on drugs and drug gangs and drug criminals and drug addicts and so on. And we're moving to a public health policy of harm reduction and essentially dealing with the issue as a public health crisis. And that didn't happen by itself, right? That happened through discourse and through evidence, and it's still, I think, it hasn't resolved itself, right? It's still the subject of ongoing public discussion, and is really interesting to see unfold. So issues around, are we talking about illegal migrants? Are we talking about irregular? And those words, I think it's the same way. And contrary, I'm someone who has a lot more sort of faith. Contrary to the sort of anyone who thinks that we're surrounded by disinformation and misinformation, and so the public can actually follow a reasoned, evidence-based discussion of these things, and understand that people who may arrive on foot in Quebec are different from people who may have applied overseas and so on, and they can grasp that and so on. But someone has to help. They won't grasp it by themselves, and I saw a comment from one of the people who are with us today about how leadership matters, right? And that's where leadership comes in. So I hope I answered that question. On the general one about parties, just kind of quickly, there's often a misrepresentation of what's happening with conservatives. Over time, Canadians of all backgrounds have become more positive about immigrants and immigration, including Canadians who would say they would vote conservative, right? So Conservative Party supporters today are more supportive of immigration than Conservative Party supporters were 20 years ago, for instance. But the difference is supporters of other parties have become more positive more quickly. So a gap has opened up where none existed before. So previously, Canadians were less positive, and that held for, doesn't matter who you voted for. Now Canadians are more positive, but that degree of positivity, there's a gap that's opened up between different parties. That presents an opportunity for that to be mobilized then, because you can play to your supporters. But it's important not to misrepresent that as sort of thinking that some part of the country and conservative leading are heading in one direction and everyone else is heading in the other. And there's this sort of great ideological schism opening up around this issue. There's a little bit of daylight, and political entrepreneurs can capitalize that to differentiate themselves and mobilize. But there's limits to it, right? There's limits of how far you can go with that. And that, as I said, that just, I don't want to just repeat what I said earlier, but that means that you could, if the current government messes up, either on underreaching its target, so it's just all words and never delivers, which is a theme you can get into about the current government, or somehow fails to put in whatever supports people need to land successfully, integrate successfully, they'll be vulnerable, right? They're vulnerable to it. But I'm just repeating what I said before, but it would have to be on that sort of, you mismanage this issue, which is different from saying you're pro-immigration and we're not.
Yeah, I think, I think these are very interesting nuances. And I think what I'm hearing is that the Liberal government is going for a high risk, high gain strategy. So if they manage it well, it's going to be high gain, but if they mismanage it, and now I think it was Naomi earlier in the chat was raising the issue of feasibility, of mere feasibility. No, it was Andrew Griffith who was saying, I mean, they're only discussing feasibility and they're not discussing the actual numbers. And on this, I can also make a small advertisement that we're going to have a more focused discussion specifically on the numbers and their feasibility in January to see where this is going. But I wanted to ask Usha in her response and defense of her radical policies, whether she would like to take also the comment by Phil on the chat, where Phil says that in Canada, the support for immigration has always been coupled with this idea that immigration and asylum is tightly regulated. And whenever there was a doubt about it, the governments were quick to go back to restrictive policies, even though, for instance, Naomi Alboim says that the regularizations were in the thousands. So Usha, what would be your take on this?
Yeah. I agree with the comment, but the point is that this is a special moment. COVID has presented it with the opportunities of one, to recognize the valuable work these individuals performed for the economy, without whom we would have been in serious trouble. So they have demonstrated their usefulness to the economy, and the public generally recognizes that. And therefore, we have an opportunity actually to present it as the policymakers or the government has the opportunity to present it as something that we can do because they have demonstrated their usefulness to Canada. So we are not necessarily saying, okay, this is going to be, irregular migration, or this is going to be something that we don't want to do, but we are still doing it. But we have to actually convincingly present a case where the public understands that these are individuals who performed basic, essential tasks for the economy during this crisis. And we are not giving, as I said before, visas to everyone. It is somebody who has the skills and who has demonstrated their usefulness to, it's usefulness seems to be a bad word, but at least their contributions to the economy.
So in the end, it's more of an instrument. I think what I hear is, regardless of maybe our personal motivations or our personal ideological convictions, the way to put forward the policy would be one of, in line with the economic narrative of immigration in Canada, so that immigration is important and positive for the country. And actually, what you propose is also answering to some of the feasibility questions of how feasible is it is to bring people in, and also the problems that they will face if they come in a period where unemployment is still high. Actually, I don't know if Daniel would like to say a word, because you mentioned before the notion of scarring, so that we know from the past when landed immigrants came at periods of relatively high unemployment, they had more long-term scarring effects. So while, of course, in the long run, things will be fine, in the short or medium run, they will suffer. And actually, whether you feel this relates to what I think Usha is also proposing to some extent, that we should be thinking a little bit more about the two-step migration process. Because, for instance, the advantage of all the temporary workers, the seasonal workers, or even the right now non-status workers, is that they have this famous Canadian experience. The landed immigrants may have everything in place, their degrees and their diplomas assessed by WES and what have you, but they don't have the Canadian experience. So what do you think, Dan?
Yeah, thanks. But could I just, before I answer your question, make one quick comment in response to what Usha was saying, which was in response to Phil's question, which I thought was a great question. And I think that Canadians do predicate their favorable attitudes about immigration on the idea of it being economically useful and on it being well managed. I think those are fundamental building blocks in those public attitudes. But I want to also point out that the way that attitudes are shaped can change very quickly. And the best example I can think of that was the huge impact of that photograph of Alan Kurdi had back in 2015. It shifted the whole electoral process in that year. So a new framing can have enormous impact. And I think this is the moment to frame things in a new way, given where we're at in terms of COVID. But then now coming back to your question about scarring and two-step processes. Yeah, I think the way to get around scarring is to make sure that as many as possible of the people that are admitted in the short term are people who are already here and who already are working. And again, that can be part of the narrative, right? We are carefully managing things. We are making sure that immigration has a positive impact by taking these steps, by the unusual step of reaching really deeply into people who are already in Canada and have already shown us that they can successfully link to the Canadian economy, and we're going to really emphasize that set of people in this next short while. I think that's an argument that would work for a lot of people, and it kind of fits the overall narrative that's been there already.
Well, thank you, Daniel. I think, yeah, there will be a lot to discuss also in the coming months in terms of how we progress, and let's hope the pandemic leaves us soon. I think you opened also a new topic about the role of the media and political entrepreneurs in well, not necessarily shaping public opinion, but also helping it go towards one or the other side. And this will be something to follow in the coming months. With that, I want to thank our panelists and also our distinguished audience. And I'll give the floor back to Julian from Open Democracy. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you everybody else as well. That was a really, really interesting discussion. I must admit, it's really nice to hear that attitudes in Canada are a bit more positive than they are here in the UK. We have a debate every week. Next week we will be having Grace Blakely discussing a new book with its author. And we've got a whole series planned up already up to Christmas. If you want to know more about those, I'm just going to put a link in the chat now, which you can see. You can also follow everything we're doing at Open Democracy with our weekly newsletter, which focuses on the highlights of the week. And that is also accessible via a link, which I'm going to put in the chat. Finally, we rely on contributions and donations. If you think public interest journalism of the kind that we do and conversations like this are valuable, please support us. You can do that at support.opendemocracy.net/donate, which is also in the chat. And with that, thank you all very much. Thanks to the panel, and thanks for you all for turning up and taking part and asking such expert questions that I could see going on in the chat. And I hope to see as many of you as possible next week. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.